You are most welcome. My name is Chima Christian, and this is Booker School of Government. At Booker School of Government, our emphasis is to teach government and government systems to help unpack these things from our registration and from what is stated on all our platforms. Is a religious school. So our emphasis is to look at government and governance systems from the prism of the Bible and to see what the Bible says about government. What can we learn about the government by looking at the scriptures? And that's our emphasis. So we tend to conceptualize or attempt to understand world events, governmental events, through the eyes of the scriptures. So that's why we are here. And a lot of the things we'll be hearing will be a lot of ideas gleaned from the scriptures, but they have contemporary applications. So the fundamental question today is, where do laws come from? Where do laws come from? Where do laws come from? And in trying to answer this question, we're trying to look at what are the oldest laws we can find. If there are constitutions, which one should we consider as the oldest one? Right? Which one should we consider as the oldest constitution? And what might we learn by looking at that oldest constitution? Are there things that we can glean by looking at these laws? And how has the process of making laws evolved over time? So we want to look at how laws were made in times past and how laws are made now, and then see if we can draw a connection between the two, and then also see if we can trace the line further up to project into the future, possibly how laws will be made in the future. Then we're also considering the full scope and then implications of human legislations, human laws. And we're also considering how human laws affect us as individuals, how human laws affect us, and then how can I get the government to write better laws? How can I get my lawmakers to write better laws? How can I get people to write better laws? Indeed, how can I even suggest better laws or better amendments to existing laws? So those are some of the ideas that we are considering at the Booker School of Government. This is a standalone class, which means that you didn't have to have any prior knowledge of what we're discussing before you can benefit maximally from the class. However, there was a previous class we did, the inaugural class we did, where we traced between God, man, and governmental systems. And we called that the contemporary Christian and his ballots. And a lot of what we're discussing is a build-up from that class. However, because I don't know how many of us that were in that class, I'll try to present a 2 or 3 minute summary of that class, and then we'll build on from there. Because like I said, this class is a build on from the previous class. And the summaries I'm going to provide will not necessarily do justice to all that we discussed in that class. So if you've not listened to that class, I encourage you to please go ahead and listen to the class. It's posted on our YouTube page at Booker School of Government. I think it's also on Telegram at Booker School of Government. It's also on Facebook, Booker School of Government, and on multiple platforms, including Google Podcasts and then Spotify, where you can, listen to the podcast at your earliest convenience. So in that class, we tried to paint the picture of what government was like and what government is now. And we said that there are two civilizations, that there were civilizations built by man, and then there are civilizations built by God. Civilizations built by man, and then civilizations built by God. An apt example of civilization built by man is what you call Babel, Tower of Babel, from where you now proceeded to Babylon. And then if you've been watching, there has been several empires: Ottoman Empire, British Empire, Roman Empire. Today you have America, the United States of America, you have your China, so there has been world systems starting, rising, crumbling. It's there, including the empires you had in Egypt, right? These are empires and these are governmental systems that helped men ascend and then achieve the zenith that was possible for them, and then also ultimately went to that terminal decline. But then there is another civilization that is built by God. And in this civilization that is built by God, we try to see God in his complete picture. Because anytime God wants to do something, he usually starts with one. So if he wanted to create 7 billion people on the planet, I think that's how many we are now, according to latest statistics. If God wants to create 7 billion people, the way he usually works is that he does not create 7 billion people at once. He might start with one man and then extend it to one man and one woman. And then those men and women will procreate and then will replenish the earth and then will ultimately fill the earth. So you heard that God had a potential. God could have chosen to create 8 billion people in one go, but then he decided to create one man, and from that one man created another woman, and then from there the multiplication begins. And so in terms of nationhood, when God wanted to build a model nation or a model civilization, he chose one man by the name Abraham. And through him, he established one country called Israel. And the goal was not for Abraham, because he told Abraham clearly, you will become the father to all nations, not just one nation, but to all nations. But then eventually, before you become a father to all nations, I want you to father just one nation. And so that this one nation will now be a model nation for all nations. And that's why you saw that several of the things that God started with Israelites, that he has extended it to quote-unquote Gentile nations, because his goal ultimately had been all nations from day one. But because of his usual style, he will start with one nation and then eventually spread it out to other nations. So for us, what God did with Israel had also become an important reminder, an important framework. This Israel has become a model nation, that through them you will see God display his might, display his character, display his abilities, display how he wants people to be governed. And then through that, you will see that it's expected that other nations will copy and emulate from Israel. That's why he was sternly warning them, do not copy others, do not emulate others, do not emulate others, do not emulate others. Rather, these are the people that are supposed to emulate from you. Same thing you have for Christians. And by the way, this class will benefit Christians because they have a prior knowledge of some of the things we are going to be discussing. But then it is not discriminatory, because you can glean biblical concepts and apply it in your business. You can glean biblical concepts and apply it in government. So it does not matter whether you're a Christian or not. The Christian concepts can help in governance systems. And so this is just a way to look at it, to say, while we're going to be dealing mainly with Christian concepts, it does not preclude those who may not necessarily be Christians. So God has set up a model nation, a model civilization. And so if you want to look at what God has originally intended, you now look into what he did with Israel for government. And so for Israel, God did not allow them to have kings for an extended period of time, because according to Isaiah, God was their king, God was their lawgiver, and God was their judge. And we started tracing that the history of what you call political systems or democracy actually started from the scriptures, where according to the prophet, God had become the king to Israelites, and God had become their lawgiver, and God had become their judge. And then we said in that class that if you looked at those three concepts, that those are the three concepts that were later unbundled to become what you now call judiciary, legislature, and then the executive. That's what you call the three arms that make up the government, democratic governance. But then it wasn't so for Israel, because God was their king, God was their lawgiver, God was their judge, according to the book of Isaiah. So their first political leader, you would know, was Moses. And from Moses to Samuel, you heard that it was God who was leading the Israelites through and through. He did not permit them to have a king, because he was their king. But then, because they could not directly interact with him, he always has a representative through whom he is leading them. So for some time it could be Moses, other times it could be Joshua, other times it could be Samson, it could be Jephthah, it could be Deborah, it could be Judges, all through from Exodus then to Samuel, you would see that it is God who was leading them all through human instruments. So you heard that it was God who was the king, but then he was ruling through men. And then those men don't have ideas of their own. Those men, their responsibility is to take instructions from the Lord and then execute. And then this continued up until the time Israelites started emulating other nations. And then if you look towards the end of Samuel's prophetic ministry, and Samuel was not just a prophet, Samuel was also a prophet king, because he was executing kingly functions. If you had disputes with your neighbor, for instance, if P2B and Atiku and Tinubu were quarreling over who won the election, they will go to Samuel. If there were land disputes, it was Samuel. If there was borehole issues, it was Samuel. If there was warfare issues, another nation was coming to attack them, it was Samuel. So you see, he was their king. Not their king necessarily, but he had a king. They had a king in God. But then this was God's representative, who was supposed to be a king, a lawgiver, and then a judge. So before Samuel passed on, the children of Israel saw that another king was about to attack them. And then they asked that Samuel provides them a king like the other nations. And their goal was that since other nations have kings, they also too want to have king. And then God told Samuel, since they have requested for a king, give them a king. But before you give them a king, warn them that they have rejected me as their king. And so for this civilization that God built, he did not make it necessarily so that man will exercise rulership over another man. Remember, we're dealing with two civilizations, and I'll implore you to listen to the first class. This is me trying to provide a summary of the first class. There were civilizations built by God, Babel, Babylonian systems, a whole lot of worldly systems, and there is a civilization built by God. And so for Booker School of Government, if we want to really understand government and what is going on there, we want to look at the civilization that was built by God. And for this civilization that we have admitted that is built by God, he did not permit them to have human kings. The original idea was that he becomes their king and then he could have human representatives. He becomes their king, and at some point he can choose to use Moses. At some point he can choose to use Joshua. At some point he can choose to use Samson. At some point he can choose to use Jephthah. So if you read from your Bible from Exodus, or rather from Genesis up until the time Samuel was concluding his ministry, they didn't have any king. They didn't have lawgivers. God was their all in all. So if you wanted to write a constitution of that nation, it was God who will write and give to Moses, not men writing laws. And so if you wanted a constitution, it was not for man to write. It was for God to write and hand back to man. So for their first constitution, you would see that it was God who wrote it. Although Moses broke it, but then Moses had to, under prophetic inspiration, write another exact replica of the first law. But that's not even the first constitution. If you ask Google today, Google please, what is the first constitution? And the answer you will find will be a little bit of interesting, because it won't be the countries that you're looking for. A lot of people, if I ask us here, okay, tell us which one is the first constitution, a lot of people will point at the United States of America as the first country that has had a constitution. But it is not. It's a very tiny country that is close to Italy. I've forgotten the name now, but I have the name. I can post the name in the group much more later, because trying to remember the name now would derail us from the class. But since the name is not really coming to me. But then this country had their constitution 200 years before America. That's civilization according to man. But then you will find that before then, because that constitution was written in 1600 AD, what men attribute to be the first constitution of any country was written in 1600 AD. But before then, you ask yourself, have men been lawless all the while? Haven't men been writing laws and been executing laws and been living in an ordered society before the first constitution was enacted according to man's history? A case in point is this. If you read history, especially for those of us who are Nigerians, I see that there are other people who are not Nigerians on the platform, and you're most welcome. But for Nigerians, if you read your history, They could tell you, for instance, that Mungo Park discovered River Niger. But before Mungo Park decided to leave his base and start following into the unknown world, as they called it, it was unknown to them. But the country you called unknown world, people were living in it. And so before he ever left his base, people were already living in the River Niger, close to it, fishing there, and carrying out all other activities around the River Niger. So it then becomes revisionist for someone to say that he discovered River Niger, whereas people have been living in that River Niger up until even before your birth. And so you see it now, that when man says that the first constitution was written in 1600 AD, that presupposes that men have been lawless before then. And we find this to be inconsistent, because if you go through any of the civilizations, whether it was Roman civilization, they had a set of laws that governed their activities. Sometimes these laws were not written down, but these laws were known. I'll take you back to the traditional societies we had before amalgamation in 1914. If you looked at Igbo civilization, for instance, Igbos had their customs. There were omenanis, there were customs. They had a certain way they married. They had a certain way they settled disputes. They had a certain way they adjudicated problems between one and the other. If you now go to Yoruba culture, before 1900, or before even the first constitution of Nigeria was written, Yorubas had a certain way of life. So there were internal norms and cultures and laws, though not written, but they were there governing the society. Same you could say for Benin Empire. Same you could say for other empires that were before the first constitution that was written in the 1600 was written. And so if you now look at that, you will now want to agree or believe that the first constitution will not necessarily be that of the United States or that of the other country, Moreno now, before the United States of America. And we have said that the reason is because before men started learning how to write, men could at least organize their society in a cohesive manner. And there is no cohesive society that does not have a certain form of expectations. If you wanted to marry, this is how to go about it. If you wanted to, maybe if someone kills someone's cattle, for instance, this is how to go about it. If this person does this thing, it becomes a taboo. If this person does this thing, he can be ostracized. Those are laws, may not be written, but they are laws. Within that framework, we now admit that for us and for our inquiry today, the first constitution cannot therefore be that of America, and then the first constitution cannot therefore be that of Moreno or any of those things. That the first constitution was the constitution that was first written in the hearts of men, and then before men eventually learned to write. If we're now to trace it, you will now see that if we're going to go through biblical concept, that the first constitution is what transpired at the Garden of Eden. Again, depending on who you ask, that there are two stories of creation. In fact, it's not either you call it creation or you call it evolution. And so if you're someone who believes that evolution is how we came about, then some of the concepts we are discussing, you will find it difficult to believe. But then the story of creation for me holds an important significance, because right after he had created Adam and Eve, he now gave them the first constitution. And the first law was that of all these trees you shall eat, but this particular one thou shalt not eat. So that particular one became man's first known law. It became man's first known law. And remember, we are asking the question, where do laws come from? And so the very first law that was ever written, so that I preface this important conversation, a lot of the issues we are discussing will have biblical connotations. And while you may not agree with it, we implore you to keep an open mind, because the goal is not to get you to believe. The goal is to get you to see that there are concepts we can take from these scriptures and apply it to modern day governmental systems. And so while this class has a lot of biblical thing to it, it mustn't be for Christians alone. So non-Christians can therefore participate maximally from the class. But again, we're discussing biblical concepts and how it applies to modern day governmental systems. So we have traced the history down now to the first man. We said that we are discounting the story of evolution. Now, while that may hold significance for a lot of older people, that for us, we find this story of creation more tenable, more believable, and that's how we pattern our lives and that's how we pattern our civilization. So for this story of creation, right after the creator has created something, he then gave laws. So the very first law that was ever given on earth, according to the story of creation, was given by God. And then therefore you see that it is not appointed for man to write laws. And we will take some time to digest this. Because every law presupposes a lawgiver. Every law presupposes a lawgiver. And so for Nigeria, if you're going to write law, whether they be 1999 Constitution, whether they be Electoral Act, whether they be NPC Act, whether they be all of those extant laws that govern our activities as a sovereign nation in Nigeria, that each and every one of those laws presupposes that there is a lawgiver. So if there is nobody to give a law, then there can't be a person to receive the law. So if there was no parliament, there can be an act of parliament. If there is no military government, there cannot be military decrees. If there was no traditional government, like you had, for instance, in the north, you had your empires, you had your Borno Empire, you had your Sokoto Caliphate, and those caliphates had their laws even before amalgamation. But then those laws proceeded from a lawgiver, because for you to receive something, somebody must give it, because every law presupposes a lawgiver. That's number one. The second presupposition is that every law presupposes that it has an end goal. So every law has a goal in mind. Every law has a goal in mind. And this is important to our inquiry. Stay with me. If you're going to, for instance, in the context of Nigeria, talk about electoral laws, the electoral laws have an end goal in mind. And so for you to really understand electoral laws or the Electoral Act in Nigeria, the current Electoral Act 2022 in Nigeria, you must have to have the idea of the presupposition of what this law wants to achieve. And that's how you judge the laws, and that's how you make the laws. So in the case of Electoral Act, the Electoral Act presupposes one, that there is a lawgiver, in this case, Nigerian Parliament. That without Nigerian Parliament, you can't have laws. So it presupposes that there is a lawgiver. But then it presupposes again that there is an end goal we want to achieve with it. We don't just want to have an electoral act for the mere fun of having an electoral act. We want to have an electoral act that achieves a particular purpose. Now, that purpose could be credible elections. And then when we now want to question the Electoral Act, you can now question the Electoral Act against the stated goal of the Electoral Act. So if the goal or the presupposition of this act is to give credible elections, then how do you weigh laws? You now weigh laws compared to what was originally intended and what the laws have now achieved. So these are the two basic presuppositions of laws. One, laws emanate from somewhere, that there must be a lawgiver, and then that lawgiver does not just give laws because he can, but because he has an end goal in mind. These are the two basic presuppositions of law, that if you understand these two concepts of law, it will be easy for anyone to navigate governmental systems, especially when it comes to legislative arm of democratic governance. I will emphasize these two yet again, because these are the building blocks of the next layers of things I'm going to say before we tie up this class. One, there must be a lawgiver, and then the lawgiver must have a goal in mind. So we now said that for the first law that was ever given, there was a lawgiver. And in this case, that lawgiver was God, who commanded Adam, the first man, "This and this you shall eat, this shall be for your food, but this particular tree you shall not eat of it." So that became the first ever enacted constitution. So Garden of Eden, which was the very first civilization, had its constitution. And this constitution was not written on a piece of paper. This constitution was written in the heart of a man and the woman. The first piece of law we ever encountered was not written on a tablet of stone. was not written on an ink paper, was not written on a parchment. The first law was written in the hearts of men. And then when you moved away from that, because men, of course, we know the story too well, broke that law, and then they took a nosedive from there, but then God started plotting his way back again. And like I've prefaced earlier, that there were two model nations that we're looking at. There were a lot of nations you could look at, but for our emphasis, you now look at Israel as a model nation, because we believe that this is a civilization that God wanted to use as a model for the rest of the others, not necessarily for scapegoating the others, but because he wanted to do something with this particular nation that he wants to do with the rest of the nations. And so, for the very first law that you will see in Israel was not written by any legislator, was not written by any lawmaker, was not written by House of Assembly, National Assembly, Senate, House of Lords, House of Commons, Parliament, whatever it is called in any of the countries that you stay. That the first law that was written for this model nation was written by God himself. And now, to tell you how important laws are to earthly civilizations, that it is God who writes it himself. And so he has not allowed man for that civilization. And we'll come back to men writing laws, and we'll see what was the original and what we now have, and how we can make do with what we have. But laws are so important to God, especially governmental laws, that he writes them himself. And so for that of Adam, he wrote it. And then you will see that every one of them, from Adam to Cain to Seth to all of them, down to Moses, God was the one writing the laws. So what you had as 10 commandments, you could call it, for instance, your constitution. And then, but the constitution was not the only law that he wrote for them. Remember, he told them how to eat, how to drink, what to eat, how to treat their sick people, how to quarantine their sick people, how to take care of their elderly ones. He was giving them laws. Laws concerning marriage, laws concerning... There was no aspect of the society that he did not write laws for. But then you would find eventually that as the society began to grow, that there was need for more laws and for amendments to those existing laws. And that's where you have your amendments to existing laws. And you also see that God permits for laws to be amended. And it is his will that laws be amended, but under a certain condition. If you go to Exodus, there was this particular story that is intriguing, because you heard that there was this particular girls, I think there were 4 girls. And then because in ancient Israel, women were not entitled to property rights, but this man had died untimely. And this man had only 4 daughters, did not have any male child that was to be the inheritor of his properties or his estates. And then the people came back to Moses, or to Joshua rather, and said, you know how our father died in his rebellion, but he did not cause us to do this. We did not have any male that will inherit the land. So what are we going to do? Are we going to allow others to dispossess us of our lands? And then you now heard what the man of God did. He now said, I will turn to God and ask God. So he went back to God and said, God, this is a unique situation that we have. It was not factored into our laws. And then God told him what to do. He says, they are now to marry some people, and anyone they marry into their family will now inherit the land with them. So in order for someone else not to inherit their land, let them marry into their own clan, so that someone from their own clan will marry them and inherit the land with them. So this is just one of the unique cases. And there were other places, many places all through Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, where they had challenges that were not catered for by their law. They did not take off on their own to start guessing what to do. They approached the ultimate lawgiver for him to tell them what to do in that particular situation. Nigeria has had that kind of situation. For instance, in Kogi State, if you remember, 3 elections ago, Audu Abubakar had won his election, was on the cusp of victory, and then he had a heart attack and died. But then there was nothing in Nigeria's constitution that factored in what the country should do When someone who has not yet been declared but about to be declared dies. And so you had something that you could call a constitutional crisis. And then you now run back to your Attorney General, you now run back to the Supreme Court to attempt to refine or to tell us what to do, because the law assumes that people will have been in position of government before they die. And so they said if this happens, you pass the power back to the deputy. But then in the case of Aldo Abubakar and Kogi State, no such laws existed before then. And so you had a unique situation that your laws did not cover, and then you have to meet an external source to have to provide new laws or new legislations for that. And so for this civilization, anytime they encounter something that was not covered by their laws, they don't go to the Attorney General. They can approach the Attorney General to approach the ultimate Attorney General, who is God in heaven. And so it was originally not appointed for man to write laws, because man did not create himself and man did not create his society. And so, because we agree that every law presupposes an end goal, the end goal that man wants to achieve with the society is why he writes laws. That is why people write law. We want to have a credible election or a rigged election, so let us write an electoral act. We want to have a cohesive society, so let's have a constitution. And if you look, you would see that a lot of the things you find in your constitutions today derives from this first constitution that was ever written. And so because Nigeria has a lot of things derived from the English common law, and then the English common law had a lot of derivatives from that of the Mosaic laws of Israel. For instance, thou shalt not kill. You see it in your constitution today. It was not written thou shalt not kill, but your constitution ultimately prohibits murder. And anytime someone's life were to be taken, it was taken under presupposed and carefully arranged circumstances. Maybe in self-defense, maybe a convicted criminal, and all of those. That was also what you could find in that first civilization. So you see that a lot of the things you have in your laws today were some form of original. Some of them have been perverted over time, some of them have been corrupted over time, and then that's on that for where laws come from. So ultimately, there must be a lawgiver for them to be a law. God was telling the Israelites, you did not obey the laws I sent to you through the hands of my prophets. So in this case, God sees legislators as prophets, because they are not supposed to write laws on their own accord. Why they are here to make laws? They don't get laws from their emotions. They don't just say, oh, we feel like this and we write laws. They don't get laws from their logic. They don't get laws from their law school training. They don't get laws from what they see, for instance, in America, or in Britain, or in China, or in Israel, or in UAE, or in Dakar. They are supposed to get law because man has to be influenced by an external party to write a law. So every law you see written did not originate from man. There is always a lawgiver. And so because we know that God is the ultimate lawgiver, when you see certain laws, you can trace it back to God. Then when you see certain laws, you can now trace it back to the source, because God cannot be the source of these kind of laws. For instance, laws on gay marriage, laws on unmitigated experiment called abortions. I mean, abortions can be heard under some circumstances, but in other circumstances, you don't want to have it free for all affair, right? So some of those obnoxious laws, it may not necessarily emanate from God of Israel. So let's tie up this class. 1. God's original intent was that he becomes the sole proprietor and the sole person who gives laws to man. And he gives laws to men through the people he called his prophets. So what you have now as your parliamentarians are actually supposed to be prophets, because a man cannot be a king effectively until he submits to another king. A man cannot write laws effectively until he submits to another lawgiver. A man cannot judge matters accurately until he submits to another judge. And so you see that the distinct operations of the democratic governance we have established in our first class, we are distinct operations of God. Because according to Isaiah, God was their judge, God was their lawgiver, and God was their king. And so you see that what you call democratic governance was written in the book of Isaiah before it was written by Greek philosophers, before it was written in the Constitution of America. And so you can trace it down from Isaiah to Greek philosophers and then down to American Constitution. God was the lawgiver, God was the judge, and God was the king. And so for men to write laws that can govern the society well enough, they have to submit to another lawgiver. And this is where it becomes interesting for Nigerians, and we will close with this. The Nigerian lawmakers have submitted themselves to another lawgiver. That's your lawmakers. They have a lawgiver that they submitted to. And what do I mean by this? The process of elections in Nigeria is a very highly competitive process. Elections is a highly competitive process. Even winning SUG presidents now in schools is a highly competitive process. And because of the high competition, men have become to look elsewhere to acquire strength to navigate. So sometimes they go to one babalawo, sometimes your politicians become cultists. They subscribe to acquire some form of spiritual power to help them prosecute their elections or to help them stay safe. And in trying to acquire the services of those extra forces, because no spirit can lend you its power without you submitting to that spirit. And so you see that Nigerian politicians, not all of them, but a good number of them, in trying to achieve their political ambition, have partnered with spirits that helps them to win. And in them trying to partner with those spirits, they ultimately submit themselves to the leadership of those spirits. And so you see that anytime they write laws, they write under the influence of the spirits that they've submitted under. And so you see that if a spirit wants to take charge of governmental systems, it will first start advertising itself to men and women. So they tell you, oh, if you want political power, come and join our group. Come and join this squad. And I hope that what we are discussing today, we know them on the surface. That, for instance, there are certain political platforms you cannot get to until you belong to certain fraternities. These are open secrets. And then belonging and membership of those fraternities, what it ultimately does to people belonging there is that it gives them some form of advantage. But then this advantage manifests that then when they write laws, they write those laws under the influence of those advantages that they've acquired. When you look at obnoxious policies coming out from your State House of Assembly, Federal House of Representatives, your Senate, you now begin to ask yourself, where do these laws come from? Where do they really come from? So for instance, you ask yourself, when you look at Nigeria today, that people are dying of hunger, people are dying of curable diseases, people are living in want, in so much misery, in so much pain and suffering. And then the lawmaker decides that the best gift you can give to these people is to now buy presidential yachts, or is to now buy jeeps worth 160 million naira each, to now spend the money on luxury, is to spend 6 billion in renovating the presidential villa. And this is their preferred way of spending public money. This is their budget. This is because one people don't know is that budget is a law, is an act of parliament. And so people look at what is going on and they think that this is the best law they can pass under this circumstance, that this is the best thing they can do, that the best gift you can give to Nigerians now is to buy cars for their lawmakers. I mean, how do buying cars for lawmakers fit into the taking care of the vulnerable in the society? Of course, so you see, you ask yourself, where do these laws come from? What really inspires these lawmakers? Who teaches them these kind of things? Who teaches them that the best thing to do when you get to the National Assembly is to buy cars for yourself, is to buy properties? It's actually a spirit that is teaching them this. It's greed, yes, but it's not obviously divinely inspired. So you now see why God sees lawmakers as prophets. Because if you had lawmakers who submit to another lawmaker, they can't pass this kind of laws, because in the night that God will speak to them and say, look, who sent you on this errand? Who told you that you needed jeeps worth 160 million naira? Who told you that this is the current priority? But when you have lawmakers who don't have another lawmaker, when you have lawgivers who don't have another lawgiver, then you begin to see the kind of things. So it is definitely not under the influence of the supreme lawmaker that your lawmakers write their laws. where laws originated from is that there was a lawgiver who gives men laws, and those men write the laws. And today the process has not changed. It is still the same, that there is a lawgiver somewhere who gives men laws. They might call it inspiration, but inspiration is from somewhere, because a man cannot be inspired if there was nothing he was connecting to. That's a different class. And so you see that it is important for lawmakers, aspiring lawmakers, present lawmakers, future lawmakers, to be careful with the spirits they mingle with. Because not just are you in a political office now, but that your decisions as a political office holder is influenced by the spirits and the powers you've partnered with to enter into that office. That no matter how intelligent you want to become, that once you submit your agency to some spirits who may help you win elections, who may help make you popular, who may help make you acceptable to the public, that then those spirits will try to influence your work. And then you see that a lot of the things you call laws today, for instance, if you look at the gay movement that is going on in America today, you trace it down and you ask yourself, who is writing these laws? And so there was something Paul says. Paul says in his letter, I think to Timothy, he says, follow me as I follow Christ. And it's not to Timothy, it's to one of the epistles he wrote. And what Paul says has national implications. He says, follow me as I follow Christ. Because we see that human beings or nations are susceptible to being influenced by the others. For instance, if you look at constitutions of many countries around the world, you will see that it has striking semblance with the Constitution of America, for instance, or with the English common law, for instance. Because men, over time, we have seen Nigerians go out of their way to go to nations to copy their laws and then try to domesticate it. Sometimes it could be copy and paste. Other times it could be copy, modification, and then pasting. And so, how are we supposed to navigate in this era of global influence? You see that there are countries who are doing well, but then we can only copy their laws when those laws are in agreement with the ultimate lawgiver. And then if those laws are not in agreement with the ultimate lawgiver, then we are not under obligation to copy those laws. America has been spending quite a fortune lately in trying to advance the gay rights movement. And if you've been following it in the news, it's Zimbabwe, is there in South Africa, is there in a lot of African countries. It's been tried in Nigeria. And it's been pushed back a lot of times because Nigeria is quite a conservative society, regardless of what we see on the surface. They have not been reluctant in trying to push their agenda. You also see this in movies. By the way, it is not in the Old Testament that you will see God giving laws. For instance, when Jesus says, you hear that they tell you this, I say to you that, he says to them, Moses told you not to commit adultery, and I am telling you now, that you shall not look lustfully at a woman. That was a lawgiver giving laws. That was an amendment to existing law. Because like I told you earlier, God permits for laws to be amended. But then anytime there is an amendment to any law, it must not deviate from the structure. If you say, oh, this is now the 21st century, let us amend our laws to allow man to marry man. No, that is not the kind of amendments you find permissible according to the civilizations we are studying. That laws, amendments are permissible, but then the original intent of that law has not changed and cannot be changed. And so, for instance, in the Electoral Act, you could have several amendments to the Electoral Act, but the original intention of the Electoral Act is to have credible elections. And so, if we ever see that the Electoral Act we have now does not give us credible elections, you continue to iterate it, you continue to improve on it until you get to that destination, which is what? Credible elections. You don't say, oh, because the Electoral Act did not achieve credible elections, let's now stop elections in the first place. You have updated the law, or you are attempting to update the law, but then you are now deviating from one of the fundamental presuppositions of the law, which is that it must have an end goal. So anytime there is an amendment to any law, the amendment does not change the end goal. The amendment cannot change the end goal. Anytime you see that the end goal has been substantially affected, then that law has become corrupted. If the lawgiver has said that it is one man, one woman, for instance, and then the next generation comes to say, oh, we are now in the 21st century. Well, you can update your laws on marriage. For instance, there are traditional communities where you may no longer have to buy wrapper, buy goats, buy this, buy the other one to pay bride price. So those communities can iterate on their laws to say, look, things are changing. Nigeria is tough. And because things are tough, a lot of our young people are not getting married. Why are they not getting married? Because the requirements for marriage is high. And so in this, instead of bringing 100 cartons of malt, can we reduce it to 1? Instead of bringing 20 tubers of yam, can we reduce it to 1? And instead of doing this, can we reduce it to this? And so you see that that is an amendment to a communal law. But then, anytime the community wakes up to say, well, let us now make it easier for a man to marry his sister. That's incest, by the way. Or let us now make it easier for a woman to marry another woman. You now see that the end goal of that law has been perverted. And that law has become corrupted. So laws emanate one from God, as we summarize. That God is the ultimate lawgiver. That the very first constitution that man ever knew is, thou shalt not eat of this seed. Of all the trees in the garden, those are your food. But for this particular tree, you shall not eat of it. That became man's first known law. First law was written in the hearts of men. And then you move from there to where it was written on a tablet of stone. And we are now back to the era where laws are again written in the hearts of man. Because you see, while laws have global or national implications, the most important aspect of any law is the personal implication it has. Maybe I should explain this point and then call it a day. Laws have national or global implications. But the most important aspect of any law, be it a constitution, be it any law, is the personal implication it has. What do I mean by this? You can write all the laws you want, but if it does not substantially affect the heart of a man, then that man can find a way to circumvent that law. If the law does not substantially affect the heart of a man, then that man will find a way to circumvent that law. Sometimes he becomes successful, that he circumvents the law without necessarily running into the implications of circumventing the law. Other times he tries to circumvent the law and then the law catches up with him. Let's go to America, for instance. You will not find any other country on earth that has more tax laws than America. If you're going to look at tax laws, taxation, you can travel from UK to UAE to America to China. You cannot find any other country that has any law that is as nearly sophisticated as America's tax law. Yes, men still find a way to evade taxation in America. Men still find a way to technically dodge it. So now you find people telling you, register your business as an LLC, make the headquarters a tax safe haven, so that when you now make your profits, the LLC that you have registered in Panama will now take all the profits. So you find then that it is in the eternal debate in America today whether their billionaires are paying as much as they should. Yet they had complicated, very sophisticated tax laws. The tax laws were meant to get people to contribute their quota so that the government can run the systems with those contributions. But these laws, although it has legal implications that makes it binding for people to want to pay their taxes, because if you don't pay your taxes, Uncle Sam will come for you. That's what they call the tax, the IRS there. They call it Uncle Sam. Because if you don't pay your taxes, the government will come after you. But then that law has not affected the heart of Americans. And therefore, they have to invent careful ways, systemic ways of dodging, evading. We might not call it technically evading taxation, because in the eyes of the law, they have not broken any law. But then the presupposition of that law is that men contribute their fair quota in the development of the society. And so you now write laws that will help you achieve that end goal, which is to get men and women to contribute their quota. But then men will ultimately find back doors, loopholes to those laws. For instance, if you come back to Nigeria, you find that the ultimate goal of the Electoral Act is to have free, fair, and credible election, assuming that's the ultimate goal. I don't think that's the goal of the Electoral Act as yet, and I have my reasons. But let's not go into that. Let's assume that the ultimate goal of the Electoral Act is to have free, fair, and credible elections. And you have written all these laws. You now have your BVAS, you now have your IRM, you now have your ABIS, you now have your every other system. And then you have your manual collation, the e-collation, the laws, the Electoral Act, the Constitution, INEC guidelines. You have all these 3 sets of laws governing elections. But then, if these laws do not affect the heart of a man or men, those men will ultimately devise ways, schemes, plottings to circumvent those laws. And we saw that in the present case in Nigeria, those laws are circumvented. Now, in some societies, you find that they esteem their laws above individuals. Then in other societies, they esteem individuals above laws. And then if you compare where Nigeria is, you find that Nigeria esteem individuals above laws. And we have not gotten to that place. That's why people can circumvent our laws without necessarily going to jail for it. But then, even when you have esteemed the law above human beings, depending on their level of intelligence, can still find back doors to those laws. And so today, you have that the American system can be gamed. Any smart person can walk around any law, really. The tax laws, you can find intelligent lawyers that will tell you how to circumvent it. The electoral laws, you can find intelligent lawyers. That is why people are arguing that, yes, INEC did not transmit on IRF in real time, but that does not technically and substantially affect the outcome. So anytime you find laws and you have people who are dedicated to breaking those laws, experiences of men have shown that they can find avenues to circumvent those laws. In conclusion, from day one, God's design was that he becomes the ultimate lawgiver. And you find this throughout the scriptures. You find it with the law he gave to the first man. You find it with the first written law, according to this civilization. That is the law he wrote himself and gave to Moses. You also find it with Jesus, where he was now acting as a legislator, amending and updating the previous law, where he says, they tell you if you want to divorce your wife, you give her a divorce certificate. But I tell you now, you will not be able to divorce your wife except on the ground of fornication. And other times you find him saying, when you give, don't let your left know what your right is giving. Don't let your people, don't give and be sharp. That is a lawgiver giving a law concerning giving. He says, when you pray, this is how you pray. That's a lawgiver giving laws on prayers. He says, when you do this, this is a law. So you find out that in that progression, it has always been him giving those laws. It has always been God giving laws. But then he appoints prophets who he speaks to. And those prophets under prophetic unction write the laws. So in this case, there is a case for Christians to become lawmakers. Because if you allow people who interact with evil spirits to become your lawmakers, you already know how those laws will end up. And if you allow people who, before they go to parliament, they go straight to beer parlor and take 3 bottles and then head to the parliament, you already know how that law will turn out. If you allow people who are chronic drug abusers, who before engaging acts of parliament, they go and get high before going to the National Assembly, you already know what kind of laws you will find from them. If you also find people who, before they go into lawmaking, they see it as a casual affair, you also know the kind of laws they will be making. So law is not man's job. Law is God's job, but he permits men to write laws on his behalf. But those men do not wake up and write whatever they want. Those men wake up and write laws under his function. So how are your lawmakers supposed to make laws that govern Nigeria? They are supposed to go back to God and say, God, this electoral act, how do we manage it? And it is under that inspiration that they write the electoral act. If you don't do this, you will always find your laws in conflict with the society. You always find your laws in conflict with the goal of the society. And this is where we will draw a curtain on this. And so let me invite you now to offer your questions, your comments, contributions before we draw the curtain on this class. Yes, Emmanuel, please go ahead.
My issue has to do with a modern society.
Yes.
It looks impossible to control occultic men and those who are demonic to get involved in the governance. And unfortunately for us, money and wealth seems to influence what happens in the political arena.
Yes.
And these people that are occultic really get this money anyhow, including criminals. And so how do we really get into this mess? Because what you are saying are the realities of life. But how do those who are genuinely God-fearing, irrespective of their religion, they are men of goodwill all over the nations. How do we identify these men of goodwill and make sure that they are into the political leadership in the country?
Oh, beautiful. There is a class, I don't know when we will teach it, but I will try to bring it and make it in the first 10 classes, because this is our second class. That class, I've not gotten around the title, but I've written some things down on that class. The making of the political leader. The making of a political leader. And this is where I will spend 1 or 2 minutes to answer your question. Yes, a lot of times, in Christians who are devout don't understand these things. And so you allow occultic men to run the system and write laws under the influence of whatever spirit that empowers them. Since it is this bad, the first thing we have to realize is that it will not get good overnight. Elections world over are highly competitive processes. All through history, elections are very highly competitive. So it's not just enough to say, I'm a Christian, I go to church on Sundays. You must know your God close enough that your God is able to empower you much more than the occultic man's God is able to empower him. Because if indeed we say that we serve God, the God we serve is not weak. He is not powerless. But then there are certain things we need to do to access his power. God can give resources. God has indeed given men resources. There are many Christians, genuine ones, that are richer than occultic men. And that tells you that God can give resources. But then you may have to learn how God does that, why he does that. There is a learning process to it. And so if you don't submit and apply yourself to that learning process, you may not be able to acquire that. You can still be a Christian and go to heaven, but you may not necessarily make money on earth. The second thing is this, that there is a protocol before God lends his power to any individual. For instance, in the occultic world, there are layers and dimensions to it. A newbie may not have as much occultic powers as someone who has become a master, for instance. And so there are certain levels of consecration you need as a newbie. There are certain levels of consecrations and sacrifices you need as an amateur. But then as you advance in evil, you find that there are certain levels of consecrations and sacrifices you need to make for you to acquire higher levels of power. Well, that in itself applies to Christianity. And you see that if you are going to be running for political office, for instance, your morning devotion cannot be enough. You may have to, do much more than that. It may have to be intense prayers. It might have to be intense. But what I'm saying is that you first of all realize that what you are going out there to do, you are going to be confronting terrorists. You're going to be confronting bandits. You're going to be confronting spiritists. You're going to be confronting cultists. And therefore, you must have to come prepared, because they came prepared. I'll tell you 2 stories and I'll end with it. Do you know that some people, and this is a true life story, I won't mention the state, before this particular person is a government functionary, sends a proposal to the governor, he writes the proposal, and then he goes to sleep in the grave and does incantation on his proposal for 3 days. doing all the occultic things, dancing around the proposal, doing the new moon thing. It is a very occultic process. And after doing that, he takes his proposals to the governor. The proposal might not make sense. It might be foolish, but it will get the governor's assent. And then you wake up because you think you are intelligent. Maybe he's a commissioner for whatever. And then in that same government, you're a commissioner for another whatever. And then in that same government, you write your proposal. And then you just did what we call in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. And you go to submit that proposal. The proposal will be thrown out of the window. And then the proposal of the occultic man. So what I'm saying is that there are elements to this, and that there is the spiritual element to governance systems. Therefore, people should realize that, one, God is interested in governance systems, and then he can empower us to do governance. But then we must have to apply ourselves to God's empowerment processes before we're able to go to the parliament to confront these people. Today, not just has your parliament been taken over, the judiciary has also been taken over. Then you cannot be appointed a judge except you become a part of a certain confraternity. It's an open secret in Nigeria. And when you have become a member of this confraternity, you cannot be judging with the righteousness and the fear of God. Because there's another lawgiver they submitted to. There's another judge they have submitted to. I hope that this answers your question, Emmanuel. Priscilla, could you please take the microphone and ask your question or make your contributions?
Okay. Good day, everyone. Thank you so much for being in this class. And to you, Chima, it's obvious that you understand these concepts. You see it. You cannot understand how things are working if you understand the roots. It's very worrisome when you see us trying to cure symptoms of an underlying root cause. And when we begin to understand the concept of laws, where do they come from? It gives you a more circumspect view as to how things are going. It only now makes sense. There are some laws you read and you wonder, what was going on here? Was this person drunk? And then we make this statement, say, what it was in, were they under the influence? Apparently they were under the influence of what was not influencing you really. So thank you for breaking down these concepts and taking it back down the roots, and it shows the immense work and research you had done. Understanding this a little deeper than we'd normally do would give us a grasp of how to tackle the situation, because the fact is the current laws are not working, to be honest, and it only again favors the higher power that is influencing those laws. And I've always been of the opinion that I think that from 1999, the idea of politics and governance was where the concept, the challenge started from in the first place, amongst a lot of other things. But then, thank you for breaking it down. And if we were to, do something circumspect about where these our laws in Nigeria seem to be coming from, Chima, where would be your first point of call? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you want to put me on the spot. And by the way, thank you for your commentary. I find it encouraging. Look, there's a reason Christians live their lives the way they do. I'll give you an instance. A lawmaker who does not understand that anytime he goes to the parliament that he's executing God's powers will take his work casually. If you listen to the first class we did, you will understand that governmental powers are actually God's powers. You see, how did men find this idea of ruling over another man? Where did men come up with that thing? The Bible clearly states, God is our judge, talking about judiciary. God is our lawgiver, talking about legislation. And God is our king, he will save us. And so, anytime a parliamentarian enters the parliament and he walks in there casually, he has already abused his office. Because the powers you are executing are not your powers. You must find that there is a lawgiver. And so, before going to the parliament, what do? You drink ogogoro. You are just jumping around hotels with girls that are not your wives, your concubines. And then after doing all of those things, you now go to the parliament to make laws under the influence of strange women, under the influence of strange spirits. And so you find that there are people who may not necessarily be cultists in your parliament, but they are just like casual people. In every organization, you find casual people. They are not really deep. They don't understand what is going on. So you find that they can even support demonic laws without necessarily knowing that those laws are demonic. And then when you also have people whose goal to go to the National Assembly is to make money. And so when any law comes to their table, you have to lobby them to vote it. So they don't take their time to probe the source of this law or what the law will do to the society. The goal of this law, the ultimate goal of this law, if we take this law to this logical conclusion, does this law achieve that purpose? Okay, for instance, if the goal really is, that's how I judge laws. And that's why I wrote after the Electoral Act Amendment in 2022, what I wrote. Because every law, like I've said earlier, presupposes an end goal. So if your end goal, and okay, let me give you this, and this is how you start analyzing laws. Anytime you look at any law, ask yourself, what is the end goal of this law? And then judge that law in contrast with the end goal. If the end goal is to have credible elections, you now ask yourself, these laws, if you apply it within the systems and the processes around these laws, will it give us credible elections? If the end goal of any law is to have an ordered society, you now ask yourself, how does stifling press freedom give you an ordered society? So every law must presuppose an end goal. If you judge any law according to the end goal, and then you will see that the law either meets up or does not meet up with the end goal. That's one. Then if you now ask me, where do they come from? I would then say that Nigeria's laws come from occultic powers, it comes from alcohol, it comes from ogogoro, and it comes from money and financial inducements. That a lot of the laws have passed in Nigeria simply because men were bribed into supporting those laws, and not necessarily because they felt that those laws were the best thing that will happen to the society that they represent. I have Uche's hand up. Yes, please go ahead.
Like what Priscilla said, it's you are going to the roots of the matter. The problem is that some of us in the society are not interested in, it's a Google generation. The first page is where we stop. We don't go deeper. But sometimes when I hear things like this, because at a point in my life, around 2012, I was deeply involved in theology and history, especially American society and all of that. And I was seeing the depth of how far gone we are. But when you say something like this now, I also want to reflect back on other societies that may have the same background you're talking about the Bible influencing British common law and all of that. We know that the Bible is one of the greatest influences we've had. The sanity we are enjoying in this world is because of the foundation of Judeo-Christian faith. But there are some that feel that they have, gone past organized religion or orthodoxy and all of that. But we still have some influence of that in their life. Now, Nigeria, especially maybe South Nigeria, they have this influence. Even though the measure is declining, but we have this influence. Now I'm thinking, because we are supposed to be doing better in the South, but we are not. We are probably doing worse in some aspects. But one of the issues I want you to highlight is some countries, if we were to compare ourselves with maybe those who live in Europe and America, some of these developed countries, even Japan, that doesn't have like religion per se. The problem is what the Bible calls darkness, which is ignorance. I believe that our politicians are actually taking advantage of gross darkness. So if we were to start, if 50% of Nigerians, if 40% of Nigerians are as intelligent as you are, will these people be able to do some of the things they're doing? So one of the main things we should be looking at is not necessarily the religious background and all of that, or trying to make sure that people don't have that influence of negative spirit, but casting out darkness with light. Like what you're doing at Boko School now is you are trying to shine the light in a dark place. So that is the major work, not necessarily calling it any religion, but bringing out the principles of light in the darkest parts of our world. As we are growing in that light, as people are picking up the light, as people are being lighted, then it will be very difficult for the operation of wickedness and operation of darkness to, work. Yes. So what do we have as an advantage that what do they have, the Westerners, the developed countries have? Is it just the Christian tradition, or light, knowledge, education, enlightenment? Thank you so much.
Thank you, my brother. And you see, a lot of people don't. By the way, thank you. Your point is very clear. Brilliant, clear. But then I want to add some context for you to understand what we are doing and for you to appreciate it. There is no society that is not religious. A lot of people don't know this. Every society worship a god. But then some gods are so cunning that they tell you that their name is godless. And while you will think that really it is a godless society, but you will find that every society has a certain proclivity. So anytime you go into a new city, look at their government and then look at the dominant lifestyle of the people, you will find the god they serve. So you mustn't have a shrine or have a church or a prayer place or a mosque. It mustn't be an organized religion, but they serve something. It mustn't be organized, but they serve. So anytime you go into a new place, just look at the government and look at the predominant lifestyle of the people. You will find the God they serve. Whether they serve that God through an organized religion or not, they serve something. That's the first point. Then the second point is that there are two kinds of civilization. Sometimes you ask yourself, are you looking for what works, or are you looking for what works best? If I want to make money, for instance, I'm a young boy in Nigeria, just graduated, 5 years post-graduation, no job. I can say, okay, let me join Yahoo people. Because really, Yahoo people, they have fast cars, they sleep in nice hotels, they eat good foods, expensive wares. I mean, life could be going on well for them. They could build skyscrapers. But then underneath that life, there is usually something. Then also, I can decide to apply myself to the normal system. Maybe I want to do 9 to 5, or want to do entrepreneurship, I want to do public service, regardless. But I want to apply myself to biblical principles or to godly principles. I can still make money. So Yahoo people make money from Yahoo people. People make money from killing, destroying others, destroying themselves. People also make money legitimately. And so if we are now saying, we don't care how you made your money, what we want is results, then we can now begin to copy godless societies, quote unquote. But then if you look at godless societies, you will see that the West you talked about, their Judeo-Christian values helped them to mount up with wings. It was that Judeo-Christian values, because a lot of people don't know that Christianity is about enlightenment. It is the kind of Christianity that we practice that thinks that Christians should be docile. It is not. It's about enlightenment, it's about education, it's about inquiry. And then if you don't get into those inquiries, those enlightenment, you have missed the whole point. So Christianity, for instance, is not against science. It's not against knowledge. It's all for it. But then if you don't have that backdrop, you will think that the opposite of religion is ignorance, or that ignorance is synonymous with religious, or all of those things. Anytime you find a society that organizes and achieves success without godly principles, that society usually self-destructs. It might happen in 40 or 70 years time, usually between 40 and 70. We can make examples. Because the only way societies can make success outside of godly principle is to do what we call exploitation. First, they have to do start exploiting the not so much haves. As I don't know how to put it. Okay, the notable people in the society start exploiting mineral resources around them, human resources around them, and when they have achieved the highest degree of exploitation possible, they will find out that, look, there are only 100 million people in our country, and we can only exploit 85 million of them. And there are only so much mineral resources around us, and we can only exploit this. But because this exploitation has given us success, but we have not achieved the ultimate success, let's now export our exploitation. And that's where you see that kingdoms tend to expand. And so in the olden days, exploitation and expansion happens by brute slave trade. For instance, you can do the history of America and the slave trade in America, and how that exploitation of vulnerable individuals and groups helped the rapid expansion of America. You can also say the same thing about the British Empire, where the British Empire started by exploiting the Brits. And when they achieved success with that, they exported it and started exploiting other regions. So you have that this kind of society thrives on exploitation. And so they exploit to the best of their capacity and they expand it. Today, you also find that exploitation. But then it is modern day immigration policies, modern day trade policies. For instance, China's kind of exploitation is not directly as you had with the British Empire. But theirs is another subtle form of exploitation. And then the exploitation, for instance, you have from Canada is not like you have slave trade. But then it's not different, because using your immigration policy, you can target a specific kind of people in a population and pull them to come and serve the needs of a population. So their immigration policy is based on needs. If they have an aging population, they will now start attracting people who have a specialty in healthcare, in caring for the elderly, the vulnerable. That's why you are seeing a lot of people, minting and producing nurses, doctors, healthcare givers, therapists, all of those things. If they have a shortfall in workforce, people who will do menial jobs, they will open up the country and they will do immigration policies that will bring in menial job workers from other countries. And then there are people who don't even use immigration as a tool of exploitation. They now use outsourcing. And so you find out that a lot of the things you call American products now are not produced in America. For instance, iPhones are majorly not produced in America. A lot of American brands are not produced in America. So an American company can have the executive, the design, the marketing, the management, but then they export it to, say, Vietnam, where they can pay people 5 cents per hour or 50. I'm just using an example, because in their country, the law says you must pay people $11 per hour. But because they don't want to pay $11 per hour, they can now export those jobs to places where you don't have to pay those things, where you don't have to pay retirement benefits, where you don't have to pay people compensation, where you don't have to, those laws are not there to protect the people. So that's some form of so you now see that there are societies that thrive by exploiting themselves or exploiting others. But then this civilization that God built, that we discussed today, can achieve maximal success without exploitation, because he even gives them laws as to how they will treat their slaves. He gives them laws as to how they treat their workers. He gives them laws as to how they treat their debtors. He gives them laws as to how they treat the weak, the vulnerable in the society, because he knows that man, if he has this unmitigated drive for success, can achieve success regardless of what that success does to his neighbors. And so any of those countries that you talk to me about today that have achieved quote-unquote success without running it by godly principles, go there. Especially in the Middle East, you will see all kinds of exploitation in the Middle East. You will see fancy cars, mansions, but you will see exploitation underneath the society. And that is usually not how you want to build a functional society. You might make money, but then it's not godly. And so what we're discussing is that our principles can get us an educated population, because it was the Bible who says, study to show thyself approved. We can give you a lot of scriptures on that education, advancement, illumination, and all of those. And by the way, why are pagan farmers more knowledgeable in farming compared to Christian farmers? So you find that then, is your religion really working for you? If I write an opinion piece today, and an occultist writes an opinion piece, and that of the occultist gets better, then how am I sure that I can say that my view is superior to his own if I don't have superior results? And therefore, that is why we know that what we work can work, but then it requires us to put in the work before it works. So that will be my goal on civilizations. We don't want to copy anything that works, because many things can work. I can tell you, if your goal is to make money, there are a lot of things you can do in Nigeria today to make money. Either prostitution, either armed robbery, either 419, a lot of things to make money. Then there are other things that you will say, I want to make money, but I want to make money using godly means. That's also an approach to it. So that will be how I'll look at the issue that you raised. Although it was not necessarily an issue, but I like that you brought in the case of empowerment and enlightenment. Because look, you can call God all you want. If you're not enlightened, you're not enlightened. And an unenlightened person, unenlightened mind cannot build the kind of civilization that God wants us to build. And that will be my point on that. Do we have more questions or comments or contributions?
All right. Good evening.
Yes, good evening. Please go ahead.
First of all, Mr. Chima, I want to commend the effort you've put in. I joined quite late. As soon as I got the notice about this, because I'm very concerned about governance, I'm very concerned about leadership. In Nigeria, I joined immediately to hear what's going on and to pick a few points, and also to be able to improve on what I know, and also share my own knowledge as well.
Yes.
So because you've been talking so much about religion, I'm going to start my questions and my inquiries and my contributions from a religious standpoint again. I recall seeing a video of Bishop Godfrey Honor of Nsukka Diocese in Enugu State. I recall seeing a video of him a few weeks back where he said, I will try my best to quote verbatim what he said. He said, in the Middle East and in Dubai and in Saudi Arabia, Islam developed the governance system to what it is today. The governance system and the civilization to what it is today. And in parts of America and Europe, Christianity did the same. Why then is it difficult for both Christianity and Islam to do the same in Nigeria? And it's that's a big question that all of us need to ask ourselves. And I would not want to allude it to your concept of occultists and acts of rituals by leaders and all those stuff. I would want to allude it to the intentionality to improve. How intentional are we to improve as a people? How intentional are we to solve problems as a people? And that leads me to the questions I want to ask you, Mr. Chima. For clarity's sake, I've penned down some questions. First question is, I want to know what you, as Mr. Chima, your particular concept of governance. And then I would also want to know, given the Nigerian situation as it is today, what are your preferred solutions to the leadership failure, to the failure of governance in Nigeria today? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. There are two platforms I work from, and the first platform is Africa's Morning Center for Public Policy and Good Governance, which has, by the way, now been successfully registered. And that platform is your regular political platform, non-governmental organization. Then the second is Booker School of Government. Booker School of Government is still in the process of getting formally registered, but if you go on our social media, it's boldly written, this is a religious school. It is a religious school. And what we are teaching are biblical concepts to governance systems. biblical concepts to governance and governmental systems. That's the emphasis of Booker School of Government. So when we come on the other platforms, we discuss things because Nigeria, some say it's a secular state. I don't believe that it is. But then because there are a lot of people who are non-Christians in Nigeria, there are a lot of, so you must have to. But then every other thing I do on the surface powers from my priesthood. So every time you see me on any TV platform, I might not be quoting scriptures there, but the core concept of my work is what I'm sharing in this Booker School of Government. So you've asked me what is my core concept of governance. It's very simple. And I'm not saying this like Peter. You know Peter, anytime you ask him questions, he say, we know him too well. He says, it's very simple. So when I say it's very simple, I'm not saying it in his own. And we used to joke around him, say, it's very simple, it's very simple. But then my concept of governance is very simple. It is that man cannot govern another man until he knows another government. Because every regulator must be regulated. Every judge must have a judge he submits to. Every king must have a king he submits to. And every lawgiver must have a lawgiver he submits to. And if you acquire executive powers and there is no power that regulates you and man becomes the highest decision-making organ in any particular transaction, that transaction is bound to head southward. And so when you give power, for instance, to someone like David, who has another king, who is God, David operated absolute monarchy. But there were just a few times he made mistakes. Fought 66 battles, won all of them. Built a civilization in just 40 years. Made his mistakes as a human being. But then he was not terrible. The citizens were enjoying it. Him himself were enjoying it. It was a civilization. That till today, Israelis are hoping to reenact the kind of government and the kind of society David gave them. Then you also had Moses. This man does not just have governmental powers. This man had terrestrial powers. He can point at the Red Sea and it divides. But then not just that, he was running their feeding program, he was running their health insurance, he was running the Minister of Economy, he was running the transportation system, he was running the battle strategy, he was running all the ministries, departments, and agencies of that government. And yet, he did not take off like a tornado. Just one mistake again that he made. Same with David, just one mistake. My concept is that men, no matter how intelligent, cannot write the laws of a society except they submit to another lawgiver. Man, no matter how audacious, how daring, cannot govern effectively except he has an internal government. A government that regulates him. Now, having a government does not mean that you will not make a mistake. But it means that when you make a mistake, you have a regulator that can tell you, okay, you made a mistake, don't do that again. But then when you become the highest authority, especially in the kind of governance systems you have now, where the institutions of checks and balances are nowhere, if you have people who cannot be regulated internally, they are already wrecks waiting to happen. In America, it is better because if you become a terrible president, there are court systems, there are media systems, there are civil society systems that want to keep you under check. But in Nigeria, for instance, the governor, the State House of Assembly is in his pocket. The state media is in his pocket. Civil society is in his pocket. Traditional rulers in his pocket. So how then is he not going to be a mad person? That's why your governors are acting the way they do, because there is no check and balance, even though the Constitution designed that, but it's not functioning. And so when you are now going to be executing such powers, you must make sure that you submit to another power that when you finish taking an executive decision, something will prick your conscience and say you did well. Something will also prick your conscience and tell you did not do well. If you don't have that thing that pricks conscience, my view is that you cannot be a good person in government, no matter how brilliant you are. Because rulership is from the heart. So there's a book I'm writing, it's called The Heart of a Public Servant. If God gives us the grace, we'll publish it next year. Any public servant that his heart becomes corrupted, no matter how brilliant you are, and you've said that we are brilliant, That's what I think that you have to have. But then in attempting to solve the problem, there are two things I want to see done. And that is also what I'm doing. One, you must raise leaders who are conscious of leadership. So there was an article I wrote, I think published 2 or 3 days ago about Mbanoju. I was bemoaning what I called the burdens of leadership. And I said in that article, if God gives you the opportunity to become the executive governor of Anambra State, what he has done is that he has entrusted the lives of 6.2 million people into your own hands. Now, as the chief executive, you and your governing elite can determine the number of pregnant women that will die in childbirth just because there are no medical disposables. You, as the governor, can decide how many people that will die of preventable because you did bad rules and you did not provide emergency care services. You can decide the number of citizens that unknown government will kidnap and kill because you took the security vote and took it to somewhere else. That governor can decide the quality of education that is given to these young people in the classrooms. That same governor can determine the amount of businesses that will crumble under the heavy weight of taxation or that will crumble under terrible governance decisions. You see, every sphere, God has just given you 6.2 million people. And usually the way God works is that he delays his judgment. Because you would want if a governor steals 1 naira today, he dies tomorrow. But that's not how God works. He delays his judgment. Even with us. Because it is not when you immediately lie, there will be a hand from heaven that will slap you. Usually something will tell you in your conscience you lie though. But then when it comes to government, we want God to carry catapult and knife and start killing every government. Everybody that makes a bad decision, God will kill him. I mean, okay, if we said that Abacha died in office, the people who replaced him, then what happens? That's why the people who are praying for Tinubu to die, I've asked them, please stop wasting your prayers. Direct it somewhere else. Even if he dies, there is no guarantee. Then what does God need to do? To start killing every leader? It's not sustainable. So what you want to do is to have leaders who first understand with this consciousness that leadership is a burden. And if your heart is not trained, if you don't understand this, you might go there. And then for some reason, some spirit will come to tell you that stealing money is better than putting things in the hospital. I don't know. There's some foul, maybe it's not a spirit, but you can't have that kind of thing around you. And that's not the topic for today. Another day, maybe we'll discuss the heart of a public servant. You will see how the heart of a public servant can become corrupted in 2 ways quickly. One, by minimizing the impact of your actions. So the person who is, for instance, the head of Primary Healthcare Development Agency in Abuja can write a memo, and with one memo can steal billions or millions. And then that memo he has written or she has written, she does not have the understanding that because of this memo, 700 women will die while giving birth. It will not occur to her. Because actually what she did was just a fast business. Nobody will find out. You just write off 800 million. You share some money around and then take the rest. Perhaps fly abroad, buy cars, buy properties. But then this person has gotten to the stage where he or she does not see the implication of their actions. That's desensitization. And whenever you are in a position of responsibility, and for some reason something happens to your conscience or to your heart that you have refused to see the full scope of your actions, then that person, no matter how brilliant, has become an accident. Because you will not see why what you do or the full impact of what you do. If we move it away from governance, let's bring it to our everyday lives. If people think that, for instance, there are people who think that if someone sent you on an errand to buy something and that you can keep the change, by the way, it's people who believe that they can cut corners. They don't usually see, for instance, Yahoo boys, when you talk to them, why are you doing this? They'll tell you, Americans came to Africa and they imprisoned our people. They did this for us. They did this, they did that, they did the other one. That what we're trying to do is to try to repatriate our money. We're trying to fight for our ancestors who they made slave trade. And you see, for them to continue in their business, you have to give them a rational explanation that will water down their conscience. And so because they now believe that stealing is no longer stealing, that defrauding people is no longer defrauding, that defrauding now means repatriation, then they can function better with that. And that is how your civil servants are. That when you give them contracts for roads, that they tend to see money and what they can do with the money, but they don't see that people will use these roads, that businesses who can't access speedy delivery of services will go out of business. They don't see that people can die on this road. They don't see that the several man hours, you have a whole country, every morning people are locked up in traffic for 2 hours. You are taking away 2 hours of life for 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 people every day. Multiply that and you see the man hours you have reduced from them, from the few limited hours. So you don't see the full scope of the impact of your decisions. Then that person has become reckless, in my view. That's number one. Then the second is that you become so close. You become so close to issues that your heart has become dead to the issues. And this is what usually happens to frontliners. Now, for you to see that the woman in Abuja is still a good person, if she ever hears that there is a woman that is about to die while giving birth, from that 800 million she stole, she can give you 1 million to go and fix your issue. That's why you have a lot of politicians who are philanthropists, because they don't see the full scope of the work, their roles. But anytime you bring them into sharp contrast, anytime you can get them to see the scope of things, there are actually thieves who are very soft-hearted. They are criminals, but they can't stand a crying person. So they can steal, but then once they steal, they can now take that money they stole and then go to give another person. So that same woman that is in office in Abuja that steals money, if you take her to see the women who that her pen has written away their lives from, she can bring back that money and give to those women, because she is suffering from one level of desensitization. Then the second level of desensitization is people who are frontliners. Now, this person is a medical doctor, okay? And before you become a medical doctor, there is a kind of heart you need to sustain. You will not be like me that can't stand blood. You must be able to stand blood. Because if I see someone who has an accident, my whole brain will shut down. And like every other person here, except you're a medical healthcare worker. If you see someone who has a terrible accident, is bleeding, is almost about to die, your brain will shut down immediately. But then for a medical doctor, because of training and disposition of heart, your brain cannot shut down then. You must be able to still think logically for you to be able to treat this person. So you know what procedure to apply, you know what drug to apply, you know in what dose, you can in 1 split second diagnose the issue, recommend what should be done, and actually get on doing it. But the terrible thing with that is that if you don't take time, you will become impervious to pain. And that's where you will go to hospital and you'll be crying, "Doctor, my wife is dying," and they're eating. Because they've seen so much pain that pain is no longer pain to them. And you also see this with policemen. There's a certain kind of training you need to have before you can take the life of another. But if you don't take your time, you will cross that fine line that killing now becomes, you can't find the difference between an ant and a chicken and a human being. And within that framework, you have policemen who have gone through training. They can take life in split second. And it's a split second decision, because if you're armed and the criminal is coming to kill you, it's a split second decision. If you don't take decisions in the next 30 seconds, you are gone. So they can take immediate and split second decisions. That's their training. But then if you don't take time, you will kill so much so that now human beings become ants to you. And that's why you talk about police brutality. They don't understand it. They kill for fun. They kill for a living. Because of their level of immersion into what they are doing, they no longer can feel the impact of what they do. I don't know how to explain this, but I just pray that God gives you understanding. So there are people who are so far removed from the impact of their actions that they don't know how their actions impact the society. And then there are some people who are so immersed in their actions that that impact has become impactless to them. So the policeman can kill anybody at any time without any remorse. You are begging, please. Policemen have killed because of 20 naira. They have killed because of 15 naira. They have killed because of 15 naira. You will come to tell them, they will see that this person, the pregnant wife, is coming. In one of the stories, because I attended Anambra NSAS panel, this particular woman, they arrested, I don't know if it was the only child or something, or the only male child. And what was that? One funny thing, the SARS arrested the guy. And this woman, every time she would cook and bring food for the son, unknowing to her, policemen have killed the son. You know how SARS people killed. You know all the stories. But every day, this woman will bring food, and the same police people who killed the son will collect the food and eat, and tell her that we'll give this food to your son. So not only have you killed this woman's child, but you had the boldness to stand before her and to be collecting money from her and collecting food from her, and you are eating. This is what desensitization does to a man or a woman. And so you now have a lot of people in positions of responsibility who don't know how their actions impact the society. So my goal is to get people to see the full implication of what they do, to get our lawmakers to see that lawmaking, the full scope of the office they occupy and on whose behalf they are executing those powers. The full scope, because once someone is a civil servant, there is a power that has been given to you. It is actually God's powers. When we got into this, you will see that it was God who designed civil service, and that the powers he gave to civil servants is a godly kind of power. That civil servants can determine which businesses will go thrive and which businesses will go down. In some instances, though, not all. And so my goal is to train the next level of leaders. That's number one. So leadership training is a way you can get back Nigeria. Not necessarily academic training. Yes, you will have to train their intellect. It's an all-round training in fitness, physical fitness, in intellectual fitness, in whether you call it religious, emotional, spiritual, whatever. But then you are fit all round for responsibility. That's number one. And then number two is to train the citizens. What is the role of the citizen in this? And I have begun that in several ways. If you are operating any governance system, you ask yourself, what is my role in the governance system? If what you are practicing is democracy, then know it for sure that democracy cannot work until you work it, because democracy operates a demand and supply. If people don't demand credible governance is not supplied. And so now that we are working a democracy, Nigerians don't demand for good governance, so make no mistake about it. Nigerians can complain, Nigerians can nag, Nigerians can murmur, but Nigerians don't demand. For instance, you will see a government trying to do something, and then you will now see someone coming to comment under that post. Maybe government post, the government signs MOU with Dubai, with UAE. These are the details of the MOU. And you come to see somebody under that post, foolish man, thief, oloribruku, nonsense, barawo. Now, in that's the only thing he knows, to curse people in government. Now, cursing people in government, how have you actually demanded for credible governance? No. So you ask yourself, Nigerians murmur and complain about the elections. Now, I'm not discountenancing their emotions and the murmurings and the complaining. But that thing you are discussing in the beer parlor, how can it get to the National Assembly? That's the problem. Because, for instance, today, there was a public hearing on electoral reform. All those brilliant ideas you were sharing with your friends in the bar, people don't have the skills and the knowledge of how to take it to make it a concrete governance demand. So, for instance, I know go agree and I go agree is some component of demanding, but that's not the only thing you need to do for you to demand credible governance. Sometimes you may have to engage. Sometimes you may have to put your ideas on paper. So there are a lot of things Nigerians can do at every level of education. There are people whose work may be to protest the streets. There are people whose work may be to call Ole Barawo, thief, Onyori, one of those things. But then there are others whose work will be to write concrete governance policies. Then there are others whose work is to support those. So, but then if you ever find yourself in democracy and someone tells you that the only thing you need to do is to vote once in 4 years and everything will become all right, that person has lied to you. It does not work in America. It does not work anywhere you see democracy. There is usually a functional demand side. And usually the demand side of democracy or the demand side of governance is usually far ahead of the supply side. For instance, if you demand 20 things, they can give you 15. But then if you demand for only 2, you will get 0.5. And so in Nigeria, we don't demand enough. And that's why we think that politicians will be willing to supply. How do you think that your politicians, even with the best of intentions, will be ahead of you in supplying governance? Nigerians want their government to be doing. No, the government only responds to demand. If they sense that roads are what people need now, they will start building roads. If they sense that insecurity is the whole thing, they will focus their attention there. So usually government focuses their attention where people focus attention to. If people don't have the skills to focus attention and to drive the government to focus their attention where they want the government to focus their attention, they can complain in their houses. They can murmur in their houses. They can murmur in the public transport. When they are flying, they are murmuring, they are complaining. But that complaint has not become a concrete public policy proposal, or it has not become a concrete action to get. Of course, Tinubu knows that nobody likes him. But then, how does that knowledge help him to shape public policy? Then you must have to organize and impact government. And anybody who has seen my latest intervention knows that I've been working hard to convince the opposition political platforms. Today, there was a public hearing on Electoral Act amendments. There was no proposal from Labour Party. There was no proposal from P2B. There was no proposal from P2B's Presidential Campaign Council. And the people who are leading Electoral Act amendment are the same people who stole elections. How do you think that they can write good laws? So it is not enough for you to go to TV and complain. You have to organize. There is a process to lawmaking. So if you want to get laws to be made, you must have to organize that. And then, you know that Nigerians don't have focus. I'm not saying this in a derogatory manner. What I mean is that Nigerians are in eternal pursuit of trends. Today, BB Niger is trending. Everybody becomes a BB Niger expert. Tomorrow, insecurity will trend. Everybody will become a security expert. The next day, another issue will trend. So you have that people are jumping from one trending issue to the other trend, and then you are not staying. That's why every given point in my life, I usually stay between 3 or 5 public policy issues. I don't move away from that. Because I have found out that you need to stay on one issue to solve it. You can't, if they are discussing census, you talk census today. Tomorrow, you are a health expert discussing medical doctors. The next day, you are they write that Fulani herdsmen have killed people. You are now an expert in Fulani herdsmen. The other day. So that's what Nigerians do. So they jump from one topical issue to the other. So before you get the government to pay attention on one issue, you have jumped to another issue. Am I saying that all of us would now start focusing on one issue? No. But there are people who may have to focus on health and stay there until the health issue is solved. Others focus on their thematic areas, whatever interests them. But then what you have is that Nigerians jump from one issue to the other without getting closure on any. So in a given week, there will be about 4 or 5 trending issues. And your normal public influencer is discussing the 5 topical issues. Next week, there will be another 4 to 5 topical issues. Go and watch all your Nigerian influencers. And then usually because people follow after these influencers. And so every given story that trends, they must offer opinion on it. They must, and that is not the usual way to get government attention. You must stay on an issue for you to get government attention to that. So 2 things I've said to you. My approach to governance is built on the foundation that governance is an enormous responsibility, that if you don't train people to be competent enough to discharge that responsibility, then they will not be able to discharge it with aplomb. Number 2, that the citizens have a role to play in democratic governance, and that you must help the citizens and guide the citizens to play that role. Today, both the demand side of governance in Nigeria is not working, and then the supply side of governance is also not working. So you must get people to be efficient supply side experts, whether it is legislative governance, judicial governance, executive governance, that these are experts in supply side of government. That if they become governors, they become good governors. If they become legislators, they are expert legislators. How can we train those people? Number 1. Number 2, how can we also train demand side guys? That look, this your murmuring is not enough. How can we collect this your murmuring and make it into a concrete public policy something? It can be a movement, it can be something, but whatever. But how can we get you from, you are murmuring about this issue because you care so much about it. Now that you care so much about it, don't stop at murmuring. Do this one bit and it could guarantee you a slightly better outcome. That will be my answer to those two questions. I don't know if they are satisfactory. I have comments here. Let me go through them and then we'll call it a day. Your comment at 10:50 says, with what you are saying about human nature, there seems to be no hope about change since it will be the same human beings with all our strong-headed stubbornness to follow them. No, it's not same. It's not. Human beings can have a change of heart. No, human beings can have a change of heart. And if you don't believe that, then I don't know what. Because I have seen people who were very good people, quote unquote, and when they went to university, they had good parenting, but then when they went to university, they joined wayward people and became wayward. And then I have also seen wayward people, including hardened criminals, who encountered the truth. For instance, Apostle L. Adejo, some of you may know him, a former soldier, now an apostle. He told his stories. There have been countless of people who have told the stories of terrible things they did before they encountered change and then they changed. Even Apostle Paul in the Bible was a terrible terrorist. If Apostle Paul was to live in our time, he would become Shekau of Boko Haram, because that was what he was doing. But he eventually repented. So I believe in human capacity for change, either for good or for evil. Humans have the capacity to change. But usually a change must have an agent, a driver or drivers, not one. And so I believe within that framework that you can get Nigerians to have competent leadership and that you can get Nigerians to have competent followership. Then you're saying that I talk about hope of Africa rising. It's not a hope. I know it for a fact. It's a fact. It's not hope. When I say Africa's morning is at hand, it's not a statement of hope. Maybe on the day that we'll discuss what that means, and you will see empirically that it's not a hope statement. It's a factual statement. Yes, I think Simon Ayamo says that government responds to demands. Yes, you're right. So since government responds to demand, for you to get Nigeria to work, you may have to train the citizens on how to better demand. So people complain, but then you know that our culture is not even adapt for democracy, because our culture is a culture that expects Messiah. Our culture is a culture that expects people to know what to do and to do it. But then oftentimes we've seen that people don't know what to do. And then even when they know what to do, they don't do it until you put their feet and hold their feet to fire to do it. So yes, we have to first of all get a citizen that can demand for credible government. And so you said that some of the golden eras in the Bible were usually short-lived. Yes, all of them. In fact, not in the Bible. Every era is short-lived. So what we are fighting hard to build now, make no mistake about it, the kind of Nigeria we are fighting hard to build, if we achieve it and build it, it will not last forever. It will be short-lived. Every golden era is short-lived. With what God started with Abraham, by the time it got to Isaac, Jacob, it took a nosedive. By the time it got to Jacob's children, they have already, in fact, by the time they were in Egypt, they've already forgotten the God of their fathers Abraham. It was after 400 years that God remembered the promise he made to their fathers. What God started with Moses, it got to Joshua. By the time Joshua died, the whole country went into idol worship. What God started with Elijah, and it heightened in Elisha. You remember Elijah performed 7 miracles. Elisha performed 14 miracles. Gehazi, who was supposed to be the third in succession, completely missed it. Completely missed it. And that thing died. Even King David, it started with David. The kingdom got to its highest zenith in Solomon. And then when it gets to Jeroboam, it died. In fact, it was under Jeroboam's leadership that the country split into two and become the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And from there, they started nosediving downwards. But in every of these things, the fault was not from the Creator. The fault was that men get complacent and stopped following the ways of the Creator. And then you also see this in families, that there are very few families that have been able to sustain wealth in their families for an extended period of time. That the most we know now are people who have sustained wealth in their families for 3 generations or 4. But it's usually very tricky that sometimes a man will amass an enormous amount of wealth. When he passes on to his kids, his kids are unable to pass on to their grandkids? But usually because the man may have been trained in hardship and now knows how to be a resilient person. But then he says, my kids will not suffer the way I suffered. And because of that, he did not train his kids properly. And because of that improper training, he will see that the kids may not be able to carry on with the business, and then that family wealth will go. So yes, there has not been any civilization that stayed on forever. And by the way, that's also a reminder that the earth is a temporal place. Let me give you an instance. I am not saying that P2B is the SI unit of good governance in Nigeria. But look at what P2B did in Anambra State. And in 8 years, he turned around the fortunes of Anambra State. In 8 years, and there's empirical evidence. Just 1 year after that, he handed over to Obiano. The $176 million he saved, Obiano squandered. All the roads he built, Obiano couldn't maintain, potholes everywhere. The security infrastructure, today, you know the story with unknown gunmen, just less than 16 years after P2B. Look at what Anambra is. So even if we try and get P2B to become the president of Nigeria in 8 years, there is no guarantee that what he will build will be sustainable. That's good governance is not guaranteed. So every generation must choose between good or bad governance. They will have to make their decision. So for my generation, what we'll have to do is to strive to say, this is what we want and this is how hard we want to work at it. And then we will tell the upcoming generation, this is how we did it. If they're able to follow our footsteps, they will get good governance. If they deviate from it, they will get what they ordered from. So it's a demand and supply kind of thing. If Rehoboam or Solomon deviated after his father, went after other women, and then the children went after other things, then God was not duty-bound to keep upholding them, whereas they are not following God. If Gehazi will go and sell out his mandate on the account of few millions of naira, then God is not duty-bound to continue that. And that thing failed. Gehazi's experiment failed. From Elijah to Elisha to Gehazi. It was not because God was not faithful. It was because the men were not faithful. So anytime you see civilizations who come and go, it is not because God is not faithful to sustain them. It is because the men were not faithful to the promises, to the commands, to the decrees, and to the ways and to the patterns that built that civilization. Let's go back to Roman Empire, and I will conclude with that. Your Roman Empire achieved incredible success. But before the terminal decline of Roman Empire, which was not a necessarily godly empire, you saw that the very resilience and hard work of Romans, the first generation of Romans worked so hard to build that kind of civilizations. Then their kids came up and started living in leisure. And then the empire crumbled. Oh, yeah, see what is happening to America. Americans used to be the hardest working people on earth before now. But today, this generation of Americans, they are so lazy and entitled. And because of that, the civilizations that their parents built, in 40 years, America will not be where it is today. It will not even be up to 40 years. And you now see what China is doing. What China is doing, mounting up with wings like an eagle. If their kids and their grandkids don't sustain that kind of mentality and attitude to work that helps them get up, then they will not be able to sustain it. Humans change over time. Their outcomes will always change. And so when the outcomes change, it is not because the eternal maker or the principles were not consistent. It's just that men were not consistent in following those principles. With this, I think we have come to the end of Booker School of Government for today. Like I said, this is a religious school. What we're doing is biblical concepts to contemporary governmental and governance systems. And I believe that there are a lot of things you can learn about government by looking at the scriptures. That's what I believe. And those concepts are what we try to teach in this class. And that does not say that this is all the knowledge there is. There's an intellectual aspect of the knowledge. There is a lot of things you need to do before you become a leader. But Booker is interested in the software of the man, in the heart of the man. Because if the man's heart is gotten, then he can bring his resources. He can bring his intellect. But when you don't get the heart of a public servant, his intellect, he will use it to steal and to defraud. And that's what we are doing with Booker School. So I invite you to keep a date with us. I come back to the next class, and believe me, there are other topics there are more than 10 topics we have planned, because these things don't just come. They come from serious meditation, serious research work, and all of those. But then I'm committed to teaching these issues so that people will understand these concepts of governance and then apply it on the surface. And whether you're Christian or not, the concepts we are learning here can still apply. So if you now know that governance is a terrible burden, then when you go to the parliament, whether you're a Christian or Muslim, you will be conscious of where your ideas are coming from. You will be conscious of the consequences of your actions, because one decision you take as the executive governor, and I'm saying this because Fahad is here, and I see him that he's rising up with might, and I see him as the next generation of leaders in Adamawa State. And I know him as a Muslim friend. And so I'm saying this because when he eventually gets to where he is going to, with this knowledge that his actions have consequences, he will respond better to the temptation of trying to steal than someone who does not have this knowledge. Because every leader must be tempted. But then if you have this backbone that this money you are taking away from the system will mean that some people will go to bed hungry, will mean that some kids will not go to school, will mean that some people will die, then it becomes a little bit much more difficult or better for you to restrain yourself in the face of those temptations. So that's why we're teaching Boca School of Government. I invite you to join our WhatsApp group and our Telegram group. Follow our Boca School of Government. I think we're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and we're now on Spotify, and then we're also on Google Podcasts. We're working hard to get on Apple Podcasts so that people can watch previous episodes or listen to previous episodes of our classes and then see the whole trend. And if you didn't listen to our first class, look for Boca School of Government on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts or even on YouTube or on Facebook and listen to the previous class. That first class was awesome. Thank you so much.